Welcome to Sifting Through the Rubble. Today, the question is why Western civilization? What we'll do to attack the question is first define what we mean by Western civilization, and also talk about the current big picture outside of our church and school, sort of in society, and why focusing on Western civilization in our school is so important and helpful to the broad dialogue. I have a lot of books in a stack next to me that we'll talk about that all sort of contribute to this discussion of why Western civilization. But let's start by defining what Western civilization means. So when we say Western civilization, we mean the intellectual treasure, the writing, the art, the influence, the music, the philosophy, architecture, history of the Greeks, Romans, Middle Ages, to a certain extent, the Arabic world, especially in the Hebrew sense, because we as Christians tend to take pride of place from the Hebrew to the Greek to the Latin, so to speak, and then the languages after that. So when we say Western Civ, we mean the civilizations that have been impacted by Aristotle and Plato, by the Roman world and Roman law, and then by the Christian church and Christian culture. Now, when we say Western Civ, what we don't actually mean is what some people think we mean. What we mean is not, what we don't mean, right? We do not mean dead white people necessarily, or dead white Europeans, which is often what people will, you can find, if you type in why Western Civ into a search engine, you'll get like defenses, and then you'll get Western civilization is racist stuff. You'll get both of them, or that Western Civ is white supremacy, which is very silly, because I don't think you can find any of that in the writings of Aristotle or Plato. There's also really no discussion of color or race there, or really in Augustine. Because ironically, right, we would say that Augustine's part of Western civilization, but where did St. Augustine live? He lived in Africa, in northern Africa, in the area where Carthage was. Hippo was his town. And so we do not use the tropes of sort of Western Civ is dead white men. Western civilization is men, women, and children of a variety of backgrounds. But the reason why we focus so much on Western civilization is because the Christian virtues that we hold to, teaching our children faith, hope, love, humility, courage, temperance, justice, all of these are sort of cradled by Western civilization and are handed down by Western civilization. In doing some last minute sort of pulling together for this presentation, I found, interestingly enough, that when people will use Western Civ as a whipping boy and say we shouldn't do this anymore, Martin Luther King Jr. taught a class on social philosophy at Morehouse College. And when he taught the class, these are the books that he used. He used Civil Disobedience and Other Essays by Henry David Thoreau, The Republic by Plato, The Prince by Machiavelli, The City of God by Augustine, Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, The Second Treatise on Government by John Locke, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, Aristotle's Politics, Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, Rousseau's Social Contract, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. So one of the things that's really important about the defense of Western civilization is that it really does belong to everyone. We cannot allow popular culture to divide us tribally and make us think that the inheritance of Western civilization is not for all people. The freedom that Christianity brings to the world, the independence, properly speaking, that Christianity and Western thought has brought to the world, the mathematic and scientific reasoning that has been fostered through Western civilization, an understanding of history, all of these great things are part of the reason why we believe that MLS, that Western civilization is worth teaching and worth cultivating. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't study sort of other civilizations or cultures, but rather we start with Western civilization and then examine others, one, in light of that, and two, as they match that. That brings me to my first book, The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. The Abolition of Man, you can find portions of this on YouTube as videos, actually, if you prefer to watch videos or listen to audio instead of read. The Abolition of Man is a set of 3 essays that C.S. Lewis gave in 1943, give or take. If you have not read The Abolition of Man, it's required reading, I would say, for the cultural war that we find ourselves in, because it's the same war that he found himself in. Of importance and pertinence to our discussion of Western civilization is the second of the essays, which is called The Way. And his point in the second essay is that there is one underlying principle that guides humanity of every culture, language, and people. Now, in the Christian tradition, we call this natural law. And that's not very popular today, but Christians have often taught natural law from the Bible, where Paul says that the law is written on the hearts of all men in Romans chapter 1, that all men, regardless of their theological persuasion or deadness spiritually or Christianity, living spiritually, they all have the law written on their hearts. So people from all over the world, if they see someone murdered, they can say that was wrong. Now, certainly, the veil of sin covers lots of people's eyes and ears and minds and hearts. But I think there are still a number of principles that fall under the 10 Commandments, especially the 4th through 10th, that people, no matter where you're from, whether your first language was English, whether it was Chinese, whatever it is, murder is still not okay. Theft is still not okay. Adultery is still not okay. And C.S. Lewis makes the point, he even puts together an appendix in the back of author after author from tradition after tradition, all talking about what he calls it the Tao, meaning the way, but it's really a natural law approach to ethics, that there is one common denominator amongst humankind that can be appealed to. And it is predominantly found in Western civilization, but it isn't only found there, which is why starting with Western Civ allows you to jump off and find other, other parallels. So, for example, he gives at the end of this book a number of different laws, so to speak. So he starts with the law of general beneficence, right? Meaning that in general, we should always try to do good things for other people. He gives negative examples. I have not slain men, from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Then from Exodus, do not murder. Then from an old Norse saga, in hell, I saw murderers. Then in the Babylonian hymn to Samas, who meditates oppression, his dwelling is overturned. Right, so there's a lot of quotes from all over the world. There's Hindu quotes, Egyptian quotes, Chinese quotes, Latin quotes, English quotes, all principles, both negative and positive, that show that the natural law approach is universal to humankind. So that's number one. We teach Western civilization because of natural law, and that allows us to go to other cultures, say African cultures or Chinese or Indian cultures, and see the comparison, the contrast, because ultimately, even though we focus on Western Civ, we are all one human race. And the reason why you can study any history and learn about humanity is because we're all actually the same, even though we may not think that we are. So that's the first book towards a defense of Western civilization. Another book, which I've only read parts of, is How the Irish Saved Civilization. Now, I'm partial to this book because I'm Irish, but this is a relatively old book in terms of thought. It's from the 90s, so it's been around a while. Some people may have read it back then. Some may still find it interesting. I think it's very good, though. The point is that the Irish monasteries saved civilization while Rome collapsed. They wrote down everything from the West that they could find and copied them into books. And it's those books that were then recopied and reused throughout all of Western Europe. Sometimes people argue against Western civilization by saying that doesn't fit my context or that doesn't fit my culture. And I think the Irish are a good example of a group of people that did not fit the world in which they found themselves, right? The Roman Empire didn't go to Ireland. They didn't speak Latin there. They had to learn it later. They got it from Patrick and from others. They spoke a Celtic. They had a Celtic form of Christianity. It wasn't a Roman form of Christianity. It was not really imperial. And so it's a great example of how a group of people influenced by the greater culture can save the greater culture. So Western civilization, the writings of the Greeks, Romans, and Christians, can influence people from outside of the pale, so-called, and then bring them back in. So this, How the Irish Saved Civilization, is a great testament to a little tiny island, people who spoke a totally different language, yet still writing down everything in Latin and saving civilization as the barbarians dismantled the former Western Roman Empire. The next one is a bit more American in its focus, but still stresses the reclamation of Western Civ. And that's, I've mentioned him before, Anthony Esolen. Anthony Esolen is a college professor. He's a Roman Catholic apologist, a defender of the faith, but a very important voice for culture, for the protection of children and of humanity, and for reclaiming Western civilization and not letting it be blown to pieces. Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture is a really great book that focuses on many things, not just Western Civ, but it is part of a larger movement amongst Christians to try to save that which we can see as being dismantled around us. While we defend Western civilization, it's also important to be able to prove and to argue that it's really for everybody. It's not just for one kind of person. And that brings up another book that, again, I've read excerpts of. It's called How to Be a Conservative by Roger Scrutin. And before people get upset about it, Roger Scrutin was English, and he's dead now, so you can't be mad at, I mean, I guess you can be mad at him, but you can't write him a letter and yell at him. His point is that conservatives care about the truth, and that there's truth in a lot of like popular agenda items. The chapters are called The Truth in Nationalism, The Truth in Socialism, The Truth in Multiculturalism, The Truth in Internationalism, that there's always some truth to be found. And the point of Western civilization is that all of these great books and great thoughts and great pieces of art allow us to communicate with other people and express the one truth that God gives and actually have a free discussion. Right? One of the benefits of Western civilization is that freedom to express ourselves, to talk to one another, freedom is a big deal. It's a big part of the so-called West. And so we want to encourage that freedom. Western civilization is not about conformity. It is about getting a real freedom by studying humanity and what humanity has written, math, science, history, etc. So that's the Scrutin book. The last one is really contemporary, and is an example of why we really wish to uphold Western civilization in the face of our modern cancel culture. This book is called Cynical Theories, and it's written by people who would call themselves progressives and liberals, but they are concerned with canceling all of the freedom that Western civilization has provided. This is a really interesting book. It's a little deep. It's called Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. I've mentioned it a couple of times since Christmas because that's when I got it. So Charlie's heard about it before and other people have heard about it. It's about postmodernism and how postmodernism has weaponized many different things like race and sex and gender and all sorts of different things. It has weaponized them in a way that's antithetical to freedom of thought, freedom of expression. And what's really nice is it comes from, if we're going to say that the classical Lutheran school represents a more traditional way of looking at the world, it comes from the other side of the camp. And yet they still see room for discussion between liberal and conservative, as long as this isn't what happens. I mean, it's a very interesting and enlightening volume because of the authoritarian, totalitarian bent that often comes with the modern cancel culture. So one of the reasons why we defend Western civilization is to fight against totalitarianism, right? Tyranny, whether it's government tyranny or social media tyranny or entertainment. Western civilization, teaching the great books, having real conversation is something that we need to continue to preserve for the benefit of our children. And so when we say the Memorial Lutheran School stands for upholding Western civilization, we stand for upholding civility, upholding certainly tradition, but upholding humility and freedom and love and justice, a virtuous way of raising children and our families, so that regardless of what happens around us, we at least in our homes, in our schools, in our churches, in our small communities, can hang on to the great things of the past. I've got about 7 minutes left comments, for questions, for critique.
Yeah, I just got a couple, if that's okay.
Of course, go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I too have heard this term cancel culture. I didn't really understand it, but back in the days when I was at Stony Brook and I was like Mr. Conservative and all the rest were nice, pleasant, liberal Democrats. Sometimes the most intolerant bunch are the darn liberals. They don't want to hear opposing points of view. And especially now, we've become so polarized. It's very prevalent nowadays. But you make a good point with Western civilization. How do you say, I don't hate to use the word sell, but present our school to somebody who's in Asian culture? They say, oh, just Western. What about Chinese culture? I guess you were saying earlier, you got to present it in a way that, well, this is really everybody's belief, or how do you overcome that hurdle? Western doesn't mean, oh, just for the, US, Canada, and Europe, but it includes all cultures. I don't know if I'm wording it right.
No, I think that's a great question. I think part of it, again, is the natural law approach. Right. And I think there's room, certainly, I've read the Odyssey or Iliad of China is called the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It has the same kind of cultural significance. It's also sort of like the Shakespeare of China, right?
Okay.
Where, like, if you read, I'm also listening to a podcast about it right now that I just found. Apparently, there's a character in that book that is also the center, the English saying, speak of the devil.
Yeah.
Right. In China, there's a character from the book Romance of the Three Kingdoms that's the subject of their equivalent of Speak of the Devil. Right? So it's very rich to them. I think on the one hand, because we live in the West and not in China, there's a defense for teaching Western civilization. I think if I was teaching classically in China,
right,
I would add Chinese texts plus Aristotle, etc.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So I guess there's a way you have to overcome this stigma that just because we're calling it Western civilization, it doesn't mean we're excluding other civilizations, but you got to somehow bridge the gap.
One of my favorite examples of this is actually the Arabic obsession with Aristotle. So the Muslim world loved Aristotle.
Okay.
In fact, I think it's the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad in the Middle Ages employed an entire school of scholars to translate Aristotle into Arabic from Greek. Now, today, I think most people would say, what does Aristotle have to do with Iraq and Iran, right? They wouldn't see a mixture there at all. And yet, people of all kinds ask philosophical questions. They question existence, they question ordering of things. So if philosophy, I think this is how I would go, right? If philosophy is common to humanity, then we should read philosophers that humanity has read. And the Arab world taking on Aristotle is an excellent example, showing that, they didn't take on Aristotle and think, oh, there's that Greek again. They saw him as speaking to humanity. In the same way that when I read the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a Chinese work, I like to hope that maybe it was meant for more than just the Chinese, right? That I can gain something from it. Yeah. When Homer wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, certainly it maintains a Greek way of looking at the world, but it was embraced by everybody. I think one of the unfortunate whitewashings that happens when we talk about the West as a bunch of dead white European males is we lose the fact that everyone in Europe actually doesn't think about themselves like that, right? The Irish think of themselves as Irish. Yeah. The Germans think of themselves as German. And sometimes they don't see how those two go together, right? Yep. I mean, old school New York type persons, and maybe others in immigrant communities, right, know that. What do the Italians have to do with the Germans or the Poles or right? They all lived in their own towns. But that level of nuance, and at the same time as an appeal to humanity, right? The fact that the Irish cared about pagan literature from ancient Rome should be an example for how other countries should care about what happens in the West. Especially when you look at the principles that are drawn from Aristotle, Cicero, and Plato. What they are saying resonates with people all over the world. It's definitely a hard sell because of the increased polarization, tribalism.
Right.
Everybody has values, no one has truth. So to a certain extent, if we can't agree that there's truth, then we can never agree on what we would teach.
Right.
But if people can agree that there's truth and see that all of these books correspond to that truth, then we can get somewhere.
Right. Okay.
Good questions. Anybody else? Thanks, Betty, for your nice chat message. It's a fun topic. I love Western Civ because it really ends up being more than the West. It is a universal thing because it is a human thing. All right.
But when you get a prospective family wanting to place a student at the school, you don't, oh, we're teaching Western civilization. That's not the first thing out. You emphasize classical education and teaching them how to think, not what to think. One of the topics you cover is, I guess that's your
that we teach Latin, right? That's one of the ways that I go into sort of the Greek, Roman, Christian focus. I mean, the fact that we teach Latin and not other languages sort of shows that we're in the tradition of Western Civ. That our book list is guided mostly towards the Western canon to help preserve these thoughts for everybody, thoughts of freedom, thoughts of humility, thoughts of justice, and to view them sort of equitably. It comes out that way.
That book, The Abolition of Man, you said that was on YouTube. Is that abridged or the entire book, just the audio version of it?
There are, let me pull up Abolition of Man.
I'm sometimes too lazy to read, but I'll definitely listen, let's say in the car on the way to work.
So there are, if it's C.S. Lewis Doodle.
Oh.
Is what it is. So if you type in, I'm not going to be able to get the quote, but I'll do this way. C.S. Lewis Doodle, Abolition of Man on YouTube.
Okay.
You'll find at least the first and third chapters. Sometimes the second is harder to find. There's also like, I see here a simplified part 2, but the doodle like draws quotes from it while it goes through it. It's a neat little video. It's like an illustration of the.
All right, it's like Cliff Notes. It's not the entire book.
Yes.
Okay.
Now it's also not very long. I mean, in this print edition, The Abolition of Man is, before the appendix, is 81 pages. It's very short.
Oh, okay.
We studied it as a faculty 2 years ago, and it's just so good. I mean, there's so many good quotes in here. Things like, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. Right? It's just a great, meaty quote. And then he says at the very end of the first essay, it's rather provocative. Our society continues to clamor for the qualities that we render impossible. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive or dynamism or self-sacrifice or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful.
Yeah. Okay.
The whole first essay is about how focusing on feelings and not on objective truth begins to move society away from embracing true things and just what you think about stuff. And then we ask people to be virtuous, but they don't feel like it.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because we've shifted the whole conversation. It's such a good conversation starter. It's a really good, thoughtful, provocative set of essays.
All right.
Excellent. Oh, good. I'm glad you like it too, Kim. Yeah. No, C.S. Lewis, I don't agree with him on everything, and you probably won't agree with everyone on everything, and that doesn't mean you should cancel them. It means that you should think. I don't like what he does at the end of the last battle in the Chronicles of Narnia, but Abolition of Man, it is so crucial. It really, it's very, very helpful, especially today, because the people that want to control what we read, speak, and say, they're actually the inheritors of the sort of the nemesis that C.S. Lewis is arguing against in the book. I mean, the whole book is written against people who wrote a grammar textbook in England and their presumptions. It's very good. Good.
I'll try to get to the library before it's canceled.
That's the terrifying fear. We studied 20th century texts in 8th grade and then again in high school, like Fahrenheit 451 and Animal Farm and all of those.
Oh yeah.
And there's a cartoon that went out past couple months, right, of someone taking that stack of books and moving it from the fiction to the nonfiction section.
Yeah.
And that's the danger when we get so censor oriented instead of reading and having conversation, which is why, again, that's Western civilization has people from all over saying all kinds of things together. And so we can have great conversation and as humanity instead of this nonsense.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Joseph Goebbels in Third Reich would have felt at home with instead of book burning, we're having canceling ceremonies.
It's very, you can't say that too many times. I'm sure our YouTube video will get taken down.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it'll be red flagged and then knocked off. Okay.
It's awful. So that's why Western Civ. We have to do it.
All right. Well, one minor point, your clock on the bookshelf needs a new battery. It stays at 7.
You're very observant.
Yeah. Well, the time stands still in your office in some ways.
Always for better and not for worse.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Thanks, everybody. And next week is Coffee with the Headmaster.
Right.
Great. We'll see you then.
See ya.